Good morning, everyone. I am Cameron Chantry, and I'm part of the RRSJ team. I must say that it's very different not seeing everybody's smiles this morning. I feel like we've taken about 50 steps back this morning with wearing masks. But I'd like to go ahead and start off today with today's scripture. The scripture comes from Isaiah 58, verses 6-7, New International Version, from the New International Version Bible. Is not this the king of fasting I've chosen, to loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? Let us pray. God of liberation, yoke breaker and justice maker, hear our prayer this day for all among us who feel the stress and pain of housing insecurity. Undo the bonds of economic inequities and disproportional allocation of resources. Help us work to provide security to those suffering from inequality, to support those on the front lines combating housing disparities, and to open our hearts to your call for us to tend to those in need. This we pray, trusting in our eternal home with you. Amen.
As I told you last week, we are very, very blessed to have Stephen Sills with us this week. Stephen grew up in Greensboro, so he's very, very familiar with our local community. He is a professor at UNCG. He also is the director of their, I've got to get the name right, Housing and Community Studies. That is what he does full time. He is an expert on issues relative to housing for immigrant communities and marginalized people. And UNCG now has some ambitious studies in place relative to providing more fair, affordable, and healthy housing to everyone. He's a graduate of UNCG, and he got his master's and his PhD from Arizona State. So we are very, very thrilled to have him here with us today. So Stephen, it's your turn.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about a really weighty issue today, and I'm going to put us all on the spot a little bit to talk about the history of Greensboro. We're going to go back to 1808, the founding of Greensboro, and move forward through the centuries and look at how we created a segregated city with disparate outcomes in health, in opportunity, in education, and how we've continued policies that make that system embedded and rooted in our current landscape. It's especially important today as we're looking at recovery, economic recovery, health recovery, addressing racial inequities. Last summer's uprisings really underscored the need to understand our difficult history, the policies that were created that are still in play today. I'm going to start off with a few maps. If I can advance, there we go. On the left in blue, you see block groups. Census block groups are the size of a neighborhood, a little bit larger. The darker blue means the higher proportion African American in this map. And you can see that there's a division in our city between where people of color live and where white people live. And we understand from our history lessons that segregation occurred in the 1800s and 1900s, but the question is, why do we still have this level of segregation today? This is 2020. We see that the east and southeast side of Greensboro is 80, 90, and 99% African American. Why, after 2 centuries, do we still have this level of division? Why, after the Fair Housing Act of 1968, that was supposed to provide opportunity for people to live anywhere they chose, do we still have hyper segregation? And in fact, today, higher segregation by race and by income than we did in 1968. The map on the right shows you poverty at the tract level, a little bit larger than block groups, a little bit larger than neighborhoods. The Tract level information here shows us that poverty is also concentrated, highly correlated with race and ethnicity, highly correlated with the same parts of town that we see low economic opportunity. We're going to move back in time to bring us back forward in time to answer the questions of how did we get to this situation of race and ethnic and income segregation. So a short history lesson on Greensboro. 1808, how many people have seen the magazine 1808? I always thought, well, why is it called 1808? This is a weird magazine. That's a strange number to come up with. And when you start delving into the history of Greensboro, you realize that's when Greensboro was chartered. At the time, there were about 13 to 15 small townships scattered about the county. None of them actually playing the role of convener of government, of industry, of education. We needed a central city to perform that role. Other counties were beginning to establish single cities in the core of the county to provide that administrative role. The state chartered a city to be established literally at the geographic midpoint of the county. It happened to be where Irving Park is today. And if you know anything about going up North Elm, you go down the hill and there's a gully at the bottom. That was all swampy. So they decided not to build a city there. They went up the hill, south just a little bit. They bought 42 acres, I believe, from a Ralph Gorell. If you've been to Dame's Chicken and Waffles on South MLK, it's right there at Gorell Street, right? And that's the namesake, Ralph Gorell and his family. I believe he was third generation by that point, a lawyer and a farmer, and owned much of that land there that is now the downtown area. They built a courthouse, they built a plaza, they sold plots of land to establish the community buildings that were needed for industry, for governance of the county. The county continued to grow, of course, but having the central hub meant that logistics and flow of transportation and everything would come through Greensboro itself. Rail lines were established so that by the 1850s, you see many cars coming through east to west, west to east, north to south, all through where we still have a transportation hub and train station today. I was down last night on South Elm. You can walk across those train tracks, watch the flow of people, watch the flow of commerce. We're back to kind of having that central city that was trying to be established in the mid-1800s. North Carolina, its placement along the East Coast, Greensboro and Guilford County, its placement within the state and relative to other states, meant that it was a really good place for transit and logistics. Many industries have thrived because of that. The warehouses that we have in the south and east side of town really were related to our geographic position and these rail lines that we're passing through. Unlike during the Revolutionary War, Greensboro didn't play a significant role in the Civil War in terms of battles. There was one battle near Greensboro where General Joe Johnson surrendered and was adjudicated in the Greensboro courthouse. But for the most part, that logistics and transportation role that we were playing in commerce was also played out in Civil War movement. Another note along those lines is that Guilford County and the area, having been settled by Quakers, Moravians, and others, didn't have a large slave holding. There were African-American slaves here in the area, but not like the eastern part of the state. And this is important because as we come out of the Reconstruction period, the population that was here that was African-American was mostly freed prior to the Civil War. They were living here in communities that were side by side, neighborhood by neighborhood, with white communities. So not the division that we see today's map, but kind of a quilt of white neighborhood, black neighborhood, white neighborhood, black neighborhood. One such neighborhood was established by Quakers from Pennsylvania Philadelphia, by Yardley Warner. How many people have heard of Warnersville? Yeah, the Warnersville neighborhood really doesn't exist as it did when it was established any longer. It was actually destroyed when Freeman Mill Road was cut through during some reconstruction period in the 1940s and 50s. But the neighborhood was established for 600 African Americans with two-story stick-built homes that they owned, with gardens that they could provide food for their families, a cemetery that actually still stands today, a church, a school. What we call in development mixed use, mixed income existed at this time period. We keep trying to create mixed use, mixed income neighborhoods today. Well, we destroyed them. They were here all across our community with commercial centers, with folks who were working class and folks who were doctors and teachers living in the same locations. So this is an important time period, the 1860s, the 1870s. We see several other communities, Jonesboro, Scott Park, Nogo Park, others being established around the south end of Greensboro, the east side of Greensboro, all across Greensboro. So why do we suddenly have a shift in the late part of the 1800s to a divided city with whites on the west side and African Americans on the east side? And that really comes about as a result of Plessy versus Ferguson, of separate but equal rulings at the Supreme Court that said that the cities, the municipalities, the county governments, the state governments, the federal governments could divide funding and provide a black school on one side of town and a white school on another side of town, that they didn't have to provide in the same places, in the same manners, but separately, as long as it was quote unquote equally. And we know that's not what happened. Equally was not really part of the development. The Census Bureau in 1890 historically undercounted people of color. We see from the census about 3,300 people in what was Greensboro, the town that is becoming the city at that time. But we know from the directory of surnames from Greensboro, Salem, and Winston, that Winston-Salem was still two separate entities at that time, hadn't run together. But we know from the surnames that there were about as many African-American descended people as there were whites in the area. About 3,300 white surnames in the Greensboro portion of the registry, and about 2,200 to 5,500 African-American names at that time. And this is really interesting. We have a history in federal, state, and local government to erase the history of people of color. We've erased neighborhoods, we've erased markers of historical events, we've erased documents. We even didn't count people in official registries. Very important to understand that while Greensboro was being built, it wasn't being built as a white town, but a town of white and blacks in almost equal numbers in the 1890s. This is a fictive bird's eye view. If you know anything about driving around Greensboro, we do not have a wonderful grid pattern. The downtown is accurate. The rail lines you can make out South Elm, which is our main street, North and South Elm Street, Market and Friendly are there. But the horizon, that was wooded areas. My grandparents, great-grandparents, were in Summerfield and Oak Ridge on one side, which would be the left bottom corner of this map, and the other side of my family in what is Glenwood neighborhood today. That was farmland at this time. Glenwood Methodist Church, for example, one of the oldest churches in that community and not established until the 1900s, 1920s, 40s as a community. You could go out what was Coliseum Boulevard today, and when you get to about Ontario, that's where farmland began. So this view is fictive, but what it does show and is important to show is that we had a lot of commerce at this time. 60 trains a day coming through this train station with north, south, east, west commerce. Our sister city, High Point, is being established about the same time. High Point was the highest point along a plank road. Plank road is when you lay timbers down horizontally across the road, and you make instead of paving or graveling, you're using planks of wood. And this road ran about 160 miles, I believe. This was the highest point, and they established a city alongside. So Greensboro and High Point are beginning to establish this interesting co-relationship of production and commerce. Factories in High Point are already starting to put out furniture. Greensboro is logistics, moving goods and services across the country. 1891, we also have the establishment of North Carolina Agricultural and Mechanical College for the Colored People. So NCANT is established in 1891 as well. It was established on the east side of town between a Lutheran college that no longer exists and Bennett College, which is still in existence. We see still at this time period many white communities on the east side of town. We haven't seen the white flight from the east side of town, but we are seeing the establishment of more and more African-American communities there. Jonesboro Park, actually 1890s. So around 1900, this racial sorting really begins. And it was designed, it was planned, it was intentional, not accidental. The investment separately in different communities. We see racial covenants. This is a clip out of some of the deeds that you might see in 5 or 6 white neighborhoods in Greensboro that had racial restrictions. You couldn't sell your property to a person of color or a person who was foreign unless they were white. People of color were excluded from whole neighborhoods in Greensboro. And this still exists on some deeds. They're marked non-conforming usually, but you can look back at deeds in several neighborhoods like Lindley Park and find older houses there had deeds that had restrictive covenants. As I said, it was intentionally planned and developed to have white communities and Black communities. Here we see Scott Park laid out. This is near A&T University. This particular neighborhood was for middle and upper working class families. It had all of the things that you would want to see in a nice development. New homes, planned areas for churches, for commercial areas, for grocery stores, for schools. Jonesboro Park, Scott Park, College Heights, Clinton Hills, all neighborhoods on the east side of town. You can look on neighborhood maps and still see the evidence of when they were built. What you don't see is all of the houses that were built at this time. Many have been demolished for apartment complexes, demolished for other reasons like highway bypasses, loops for the city. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the 1940s and 50s. This is from an advertisement for Noco Park. And you'll see some of these houses being built by the same developers building in the west side and the northwest side of town. Beautiful architecture, well built. This was an upscale neighborhood meant for doctors, lawyers, professors at A&T, city council persons. It had a 12-acre park, the only African-American hospital, L. Richards Memorial Hospital on the east side for African-Americans. It had, again, all of the things that you would want to see in a Starmount or any other country club neighborhood. This was the high-end African-American community. Recent study of architecture of Black communities finds that so few of these houses are still in existence, unfortunately. Another note, researcher from Urban Institute has studied cities across the United States looking at comparable buildings, the same builder, the same architectural style, the same number of bedrooms and square footage, one in Black communities, one in white communities, and looking at the disparities in value of homes. Think about your own personal savings and how much is wrapped up in home ownership and how that wealth has passed generation to generation as your houses have increased in value, but the same house built by the same person with the same techniques in a Black community has not held value, it's lost value over time. As we said, separate but equal, the 12-acre park, the hospital, L. Richards Memorial. Does anybody know what this is today? No? It's an apartment, yeah.
What is it? I can't see.
This is L. Richards Memorial Hospital on the east side of town, just south of NCA&T's campus. And it's now an apartment complex. They filled in the rest of the plot of land that was beautifully landscaped and its additional apartment complexes. But this was converted a few years back. It had been, I believe, a nursing home for a while and a rehab facility before being decommissioned and put into use as housing. About the same time that we're seeing this development on the east side of town, and we're seeing a rapid growth across Greensboro in population size, we're also trying to wrestle with infrastructure issues. Water has always been an issue for Greensboro. We have lots of good rivers and lakes, but we also have upstream pollutants, and we're unfortunately putting stuff in and making downstream pollutants. If you're following anything with PFAs, PFOs, Gen X and things like that, we see this still as an issue in our Greensboro water supply. Solid waste has been an issue. When you have a growing population, you're producing a lot of material that needs to be put into a landfill. Most people have heard of White Street landfill and the contentious reopening that occurred about a decade ago there. Not many people know that we were going to have an incinerator and landfill downtown. If you know where the Civil War Cemetery is, and I think now Storage B has been built there. Cycles de Oro is right about there, along Battleground as it's coming out of the downtown area. Back in 1922, the city council wanted to put an incinerator and landfill there. It's low-lying land. It's along that creek that feeds the Buffalo Creek eventually. And they thought, this would be a good place, but there was resistance. As you would expect, we know the story today. If somebody's going to put an incinerator and landfill in your neighborhood, everybody gets together and says, no, not in my backyard. Not in my backyard might be development of an apartment complex. It might be a new shopping center. It might be a low-income community. But in this case, it was an incinerator and landfill. And so they were successful. City council looked around a little bit more and found just a mile east of downtown, a couple miles out, just outside the boundary for the city, there was a small farming community of African Americans, and that land was cheap. So they put an incinerator and landfill there. This is the Cottage Grove neighborhood today, English Street between Market and Gate City Boulevard, just east of what's Willow Oaks today. It was Morningside Homes until the 90s. That's where they located the incinerator. Began operating in the mid-1920s, operated until the mid-1950s. Incinerated waste was just dumped into the ground by trucks and a little bit of soil put over the top. In fact, in many places, it's only 8 inches between the soil cap and the waste that's beneath it. We'll come back to this issue, but think of that as something in your neighborhood. What happens when you have solid waste materials leaching into your water table right next to where apartment complexes, a child's school, playgrounds, and other things are located? This is how we developed or underdeveloped or undeveloped or tore apart neighborhoods with environmental justice issues like incinerators in Black communities. Homeowners Loan Corporation, what is this map typically called in everyday speech? Redlining map. Okay, so this is Greensboro's redlining map. In 1937, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal-backed independent private company like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, like the Postal Service. The feds step in at times to regulate and control it, but the Treasury just essentially feeds funding into it. It really created the mortgage market that we have today. The mortgage market that lets somebody like me buy a house that's 8 or 10 times my annual salary, right? And then pay it off over the period of 20 or 30 years. It let people like me at that time, white, buy houses that we couldn't really afford cash at the time, but it didn't allow people of color to buy those same houses. And the effect of this, when you have a segregated city by law, when you have communities that white people live in and that Black people live in, is to devalue the homes in the Black community. You make it, or keep it, in this case, an all cash market. If it's an all cash market, then people have to have enough cash on hand to purchase it. They can't borrow, then they have to, so that drops the price of things. In a market where I don't have to have all cash, I can leverage my income and the security of my W-2 job and my education and my parents' backing or whatever. I can buy more than my means right now and stretch it out over a period of time, which means I can further develop. I can invest more in that area. Those values go up, right? And that's what we're seeing actually right now with cheap credit. 2.5%, 3% loans on mortgages for 30 years. That's caused our prices to go up 26, 27% in just the last year in mid-market and up. On the affordable range of the market, we've actually doubled in prices because it's an all-cash market there. So you can see that the neighborhoods that we were talking about in the 1920s and the 1800s, the Scott Parks, Clinton Hills, Noka Parks, Warnersvilles, they're all red. They're considered high risk, don't loan here. Green neighborhoods are the Irving Parks, the new Irving Parks, north towards Page, west towards Grimsley, areas that are still affluent, desirable, well-resourced, good parks, good sidewalks, all the amenities. Those were green areas. Yellow and blue areas were a little bit more risky. We know that the southwest part of town was white working class into about the 1980s. It became mixed income and mixed ethnicity. The northeast part of town shifted in the 1970s with some block busting. So we see in 16th Street and northeast of what was Carolina Circle Mall. Those of you who remember, yeah, okay. I have an old map of Greensboro in my head. That area shifted from all white working class to white and Black in the 1970s and 80s. So we end up with what's now a crescent, and that crescent mirrors this crescent of yellow and red neighborhoods that were devalued and turned from owner occupied to renter occupied, that denied credit. We see as kind of the root or the core of the continuum. Some people call it a comma or a U. When they're talking about planning, they look at the map and they see the crescent of color, race, income status, and we'll talk about social determinants and outcomes also along the same U in a few moments. Redlining was not the only thing that occurred that devalued Black communities' housing and mined wealth from these communities. The Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 also took away wealth by denying income increases and security in labor rights. We see that many of the professions that African Americans were working in were excluded from fair labor standards. Your overtime pay, your 5-day work week or 40-hour work week, these were excluded. The minimum wage was established in 1938 as a result of this act, and it had a gradual increase over the period of a decade and a half, so that people's standards of living would rise. That did not translate to the African American community and that workforce. So on one hand, we've got denial of credit, access to credit. On the other, we've got limitation of income. We're reducing the value of a population's labor. We're devaluing their work, so they can't increase this way, they can't increase this way. It's putting a squeeze on the community. GI Bill. We had 1.5 million, 1.2 million African-American GIs who served, but were denied access to the loans that were guaranteed to the other 4.3 million white GIs who came back and bought houses. My grandfather's generation. I told you that my grandmother's farm actually was on Ontario and Coliseum Boulevard in the Glenwood neighborhood. It's really Piedmont Heights, I believe there. She moved a few blocks north, just right at the Coliseum actually, in the 1940s with her husband, Henry Nelson, who had an 8th grade education, left the farm in Summerfield to work in Rollins hosiery mill before eventually being drafted and going to serve in the war in the Pacific. He came back, GI Bill allowed him to have the capital to build a house, a nice little 2x2, Glenwood's traditional 900 square feet. They had a nice attic for storage and a porch off the side. And about 1.5 acres where they did a lot of gardening. GI Bill allowed a person with an 8th grade education with a farming and hosiery mill background to afford a house and eventually buy a service station, Phillips 76 on Patton Avenue, which going way back and not in existence for a long time. But my grandfather had access to capital. He was white, and he was a GI. Other communities, 1.2 million African Americans, didn't get that same access. Much like the Homeowners Loan Corporation, this was federal funding. The act itself did not exclude African Americans, but the businesses that got Treasury money made policies that denied them access to the funding. They weren't able to get the loans because the banks said no. Urban renewal hit Greensboro hard. Greensboro was one of the first southern cities to say, yes, we'll take federal money to do some urban renewal. We'll remove blight. This remove blight term is code. It's very clear. We'll remove blight means we'll get rid of African-American neighborhoods. We'll destroy them from the core. We'll destroy their business districts. We'll take land. We'll cut highways through. We'll redevelop in the image that we would like for the community. This is the period of the 1940s to the 60s, and we see this occurring all over the state. We see East Durham, South Charlotte, Winston, Highway 52, Greensboro, Highway 29, Asheville, highway cut-throughs that took the small African-American community there and divided it. We see growth of public housing during this time. A much needed social support system, but when you put 400 units in one neighborhood of people who are struggling income-wise, then you have a devaluing of the neighborhood around it. We know that scatter site or Section 8, which we use today, works much better. It takes people with low economic status and moves them throughout the community to have equal access to opportunity, to schools, to transportation. But what we did was we concentrated in just a few neighborhoods. This business district, which was in Warnersville, was destroyed. What's interesting, when you look at this picture, you see a market, a seafood market. You see clothing, you see restaurants, you see vibrant business. We have very little of this neighborhood scale vibrant business anymore. Think about Sticks and Stones and the filling station and the Little Bestway, Wahoo's Tavern, and a couple of coffee shops at Elam and Walker. Thank you. We used to have neighborhood groceries, walking distance, retail shops, restaurants, like that throughout the city. But we redeveloped, and this is now Freeman Mill Road. We made it an easier access for people coming from outside town to downtown, destroying the fabric of a community. Urban renewal, I mentioned 29. 29, I hate 29. It is the worst to merge onto. It's the worst to drive along. You always think that you're going to hit the wall or be bumped off into. As you're driving north, coming from south to north, look to the east side of the road. You'll see Franklin Academy. You'll see, Lincoln Academy and Dudley High School. And you'll see that this highway cut right through their land. The elementary and middle school is almost on the highway. It's just a few hundred yards off the highway. Imagine if that were on the west side of town, heading by a middle school or an elementary school. People would have said, no, we don't want our kids exposed to all of that highway traffic and noise and pollution. It cut right through Greensboro Park, this historic African-American community established in the 1870s. It continued north, cutting and dividing neighborhoods. And now it is the kind of a diagonal line that divides white Greensboro and black Greensboro from each other. It also divides by life expectancy. You're going to see in just a few moments that there's a 20-year difference in life expectancy living on the east side of 29 versus the west side of 29. Public housing, I mentioned. Again, we were fairly early. We had authority to establish the public housing in 1941. We didn't build until a decade later. Smith Homes for white community, Morningside Homes for African-American community. Later during desegregation, both became communities of color. Smith Homes today is going through what's called RAD, it's a conversion and upgrading of the complex to today's standards. Interestingly, if you look at ASMA maps of Greensboro, you see a concentration around Smith Homes, and that's because for the longest time, they've been exempt from modern building code because they're public housing. How is that right? How do we have public facilities that don't have to have modern HVAC systems that then create the conditions that exacerbate respiratory illnesses? That doesn't seem congruent. Smith Homes and Morningside Homes, later joined by Ray Warren and Hampton Homes. You know that Morningside now no longer exists. It was also the site of the Greensboro Massacre. Memorials around that massacre stand in the Willow Oaks community. Willow Oaks is a Hope 6 project from HUD, a program to try to create more of a mixed income neighborhood with some units that are supported, some units that are market rate and affordable. Fair Housing Act of 1968 was intended to solve these issues of a racialized past. My phone is causing microphone feedback. The 1968 Fair Housing Act, coming right at the heels of the death of Martin Luther King, President Johnson signing it into law, was intended to allow people free choice to move wherever they wanted. Not to have real estate agents tracking or guiding people to particular neighborhoods, not allowing racial restrictions and covenants on deeds that said you cannot pass the property to a person of color, not allowing redlining or any kinds of disproportionate access to mortgage loans. In rental market and in the mortgage market, we were supposed to have free choice to live where we wanted. Unfortunately, this created a white flight. I live in Forest Oaks, down southeast part of the county. It was built at this time period as a reaction to the fair housing and fear of people coming into white communities. So the white community fled to the southeast part of the county, built its own golf course community, and excluded itself. I kind of laugh today when I look around and I see that I live in a really diverse neighborhood now. Many African Americans, many people from other countries living in this community that was part of white flight. So I kind of get a good chuckle out of that. What's depressing about the Fair Housing Act is that even though it has been upgraded and updated and given more enforcement, when we test paired testing studies, sending the same person on paper, one person white, one person black, but in all other things, all other respects equal to a property, we see that they're treated differently. We've done paired testing since 2006 in Greensboro with white, black, Asian, Latino testers, male, female, LGBT, lesbian couples, straight couples, gay couples. We've tested every pattern we could, accented callers. We know that people are treated differently. When we look at mortgage data, we see that people have differential access to capital. Fair Housing Act hasn't corrected the issue. The issue is more endemic than a single policy can solve. Let's look at the outcomes. We're still here. We're still a divided city 50 years after the Fair Housing Act was established. 100 years after, 120 years after Plessy versus Ferguson, we're still separate and not equal. Our outcomes, white families in general have 10 times the wealth of African-American families. And the key difference is home ownership 2 generations ago. My grandfather moving from a farm that they actually lost in the 1920s. That's why he left in 8th grade and went to a factory. That wealth that he passed on, allowing my mother to get pink collar jobs and a master's degree, my dad a doctorate, and move up the economic scale, was denied for the families of color. We see that the gap in home ownership in 1968 was 66% white families owning their own homes and 41% of black families. And this was already down from the 1920s and 30s because of redlining. So this is when we're hitting the bottom in 1968 Fair Housing Act, 40% of black families own their home. Just in the last 20 years, since 2000, just for Greensboro, the rates of home ownership for black families have fallen from that 40%, 39.3%, to about a quarter, 27.6%, and continuing to fall. The foreclosure market hit the African-American community very hard and hasn't been able to recover as much as the white community. Pardon me. White home ownership rates, 66% in 1968, just 63% in 2020. So the white community has not suffered as much of a shift to the rental market, even weathering the foreclosure market downturn. Poverty, concentrated on east and southeast side, but also in the northeast and southwest. Since the 1968 Fair Housing, we've added to Greensboro's population black and brown people. We have a Hispanic population of about 7%, an Asian population of about 3%, 172 languages spoken in the school system, an ESL school called the Newcomer School just for immigrants and refugees, and refugee resettlement to the community. Much of that in the northeast and southwest parts of town. Poverty is highly concentrated in a few neighborhoods. Over 40% of families that live in these neighborhoods are under the poverty line. Oak Grove, Smith Homes, Warnersville, Glenwood, parts of Glenwood, Willow Oaks, Cottage Grove, Bessemer Street, and Summit Avenue. All of these areas, 40% or more of families living under the poverty line. We have the same neighborhoods designated by HRSA as medically underserved, with high rates of infant mortality, with high rates of lack of medical services, both primary and secondary emergency services, high rates of poverty, all coming together to create health issues. These areas are called food deserts by the USDA, low income, low access for transportation and close food proximity. Low food access has an outcome of obesity. People sometimes can't wrap their head around this. When you don't have access to healthy and affordable foods in your neighborhood, you stock up, and you stock up on bulk goods that are high carb, high calorie, low nutrition. This creates a situation with high obesity and the resulting diabetes levels. We see poor quality housing. Since 2016, I've done parcel level assessments of housing, 78,000 parcels in Greensboro. We've looked at roofs to foundations. We see the concentration again in these same neighborhoods. We've taken the capital out of the neighborhood, we've reduced the value of the homes, we've turned them into rental properties, and we've used them as a mine, a strip mine. You take all of the equity out, you don't put anything back into it to maintain it. That is then correlated with respiratory illnesses. This is Cone Health data. Rates of asthma, we see much higher in the red spots on the east side of town than would be expected, and much lower on the northwest side. This is a newer map, last year's data from Cone Health, looking at about 70 different respiratory illness ICD codes. We work with the chief pulmonologist and Cone's data folks, and we see again that crescent on the east side of town where COPD, asthma, and other respiratory illnesses are the highest. And all of these are issues that are correlated with environmental conditions. We see higher rates of people renting in the southeast side of town and then in the business corridor going west of town. And one of the results then is higher rates of eviction, in fact, disproportionate to other rental neighborhoods. This stir of people coming and going has an impact on schools, it has an impact on infrastructure, it has an impact on the quality of life in the community. As I mentioned, mortgage markets, there's still disproportionality. This is 5 years of data coming through the last housing crisis. We saw that white borrowers had a 70% likelihood of getting a loan versus African Americans at 60% or lower. When we account for all things, which neighborhood, how much income do you have, how much of a house, what's the loan to value ratio, all of the things that the broker is looking for to see if you qualify for a loan, we saw that all things being equal, African American females had a 26% less likelihood of getting the loan than a white male, Black males 25% less likelihood, and so on. You see the racial disproportionality in access to credit. Remember that landfill? East side of town, the incinerator. All of that waste was buried and a park was put on top of it, Bingham Park in 1972. All of that material is now leaching out. This is the stream bank, and you can see bottles and glass from the 1940s and 50s coming into the stream and flowing down to the South Buffalo Creek. The toxins include lead, manganese, arsenic, about 10 different heavy metals that all have cancer as one of the potential outcomes, fetal issues, neonatal issues, Alzheimer's, other issues with long-term exposure. This is the land that we have relegated to people in the east side of town. There are 3 former landfills in the east side of town, 1 continuing to operate and 2 now defunct. They're buried right under people. And in fact, on the lower right side of the map, that's Hampton Elementary School, their playground area right on top of the landfill. I'm gonna skip forward here, but we see disproportionate outcomes everywhere we look in school scores related to housing conditions and health conditions. When you have asthma and you have poor quality housing, you miss school at a disproportionate rate to your peers, and it has an impact on your educational attainment and outcomes. The COVID pandemic, this is the risk map. We'll see that the risk was highest in the east area of town, and this is just 2 months ago, the vaccination rates at the tract level, and we see also the disproportionality in the east side of town. Lower life expectancy. Lighter areas are lower life expectancy, darker areas are higher life expectancy. That bifurcation you can see. White neighborhoods have the highest 85 years to 88 years, while African-American neighborhoods 69 to 73 years. 17 years difference, just a mile or so apart from each other. The key takeaways here: racial planning, racialized policies for the past century and a half have really created these segregated communities, rooted it in our culture, in our landscape, in our housing market, and has created a marginalization of people who live in particular neighborhoods. To address these issues, we have to think very carefully about the policies and the economics at play. And we have to also think about how we change the culture and how we think differently about East and West Greensboro. We need just a mass of organizations to come around this issue. Government, for sure, in instituting policies that deconstruct racialized planning, but also philanthropy to invest in neighborhoods, infrastructure, and people. What we have to watch out for, though, is what we've seen in other communities where we've invested a lot in the buildings, but not the people, and as a result, created a leaf blower effect, moving people out of their neighborhoods, upscaling those neighborhoods, but making it so that they can no longer afford to live there. We have to honor the bifurcated history of Greensboro, the legacy of segregation, understanding history of Black and white communities, but we also have to make opportunities for people to live outside of these segregated neighborhoods. And I'm happy to take any questions. I'm not sure how much time we've got left. Certainly.
First of all, I would love to congratulate you. This was excellent. And I think what you have discussed today is something that happens in every community throughout the United States, and which has led to poverty, which has led to our crime and violence. And you didn't mention the point where organizations like the National Association of Realtors, the Home Builders, and the Morgan Association has played in the role of creating this segregation.
Definitely.
And I just wanted to thank you, because when we think about Chicago, and we can look at Chicago and look at the housing there, and we can see how the crime and things that exist today started back in the 1900s when this urban planning did not exist. We can look at Washington, D.C. You can look at my home county, Virginia. And I just want to thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And you're right. I look at all of the red line maps right now for all of North America. They're correlated with CDC health risks currently. Richmond, University of Virginia in Richmond has built a beautiful database. And I went back to look at red-lined communities in 1930s that are green today in CDC. There aren't any. The only ones that has happened in is where we've seen complete gentrification occur, and they're no longer African-American neighborhoods. And that's the fear. You're right. Realty associations, planning boards, zoning commissions, and we resist. Newspaper this week, 130 unit apartment complex and multi-family, multi-use in British Woods. We resist that because it might hurt our property values. Single family zoning is a privilege, and it's one of the things that has created disproportionate access to affordable housing. I live in an 8-bedroom golf course house that's really quite obscene. I have an Airbnb downstairs, which is how I justify it. But, how can we have that kind of disproportionate housing? The resistance to doing infill development in that neighborhood. There are plenty of lots that could be built on. Townhomes could be built there, duplexes could be built there, but because our zoning by right says single family only, we exclude the possibility of more affordable types of planning. We're missing the middle of the market. This is a mantra of many people in the affordable housing world, the missing middle. We don't have duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. We used to have the opportunity for middle-class people, working-class people, to live in one unit, rent two other units, and make their mortgage. People now in the investing world call it house hacking, and you see it in the Boulder, Colorados, and the San Diegos and San Franciscos. You don't see it in the Greensboros, except maybe in the college district, right, where you've got bedrooms carved up. But imagine in your own neighborhood, some of these 5,000, 6,000 square foot houses divided into three 2,000 square foot units would make sense. Our infrastructure can bear that out, but people are afraid of the devaluing of their properties if we make multifamily by right. So realtors, planners, zoning, and us are all part of it.
Have you shown this to any of the government city council?
Yes, multiple groups with city council, United Way, Community Foundation, Greater Greensboro, on and on. Yeah.
Board?
I'm sorry?
The zoning board?
I have not gotten invited to the zoning board yet.
So, even though I know a lot of this, it's always overwhelming to look at, especially with data. And what we're looking at is systemic racism.
Yes.
I would argue.
Yes.
Which is a buzzword, which turns a lot of people off. I would argue as well that the number one way to turn it around is reparations. Another buzzword that turns a lot of people off is political. So when I hear to turn to the federal government to make change, I get tense on that because it since the 1808s has not worked. Is there an example across the country that you've seen that is working when it comes to equity and equality?
Yeah. Few and far between, and some of the structural issues are built into our economic system. So ways that you can do it: reparations, just a payment, possible. There have been several small areas that have done that, usually with a lot of resistance from folks writing checks. But other ways to do reparations, though, are zero interest loans for currently non-qualifying renters. You've got a 500 credit score, you're not going to get any kind of assistance. Well, what if you've got a zero interest loan on a rehab house that you then get to own and the infrastructure needed to help you maintain that over time and build wealth? Is that the right approach? I think that more homeownership in neighborhoods that are 85, 90% renter occupied would be good at the neighborhood level. It would be good for those schools, and it would be good for those who are moving in. We've seen some neat models there. Workforce development programs for later teens and early adults, partnered and paired with Fannie Mae funding for the house that they're rehabbing. So you learn construction and trade skills that pay $25 to $50 an hour, good wages, electricians, plumbers, roofers, et cetera. And then they work on a house and then they get to assume ownership of the house. So 19-year-old workforce development student gets ownership of the house for they and their families to move into. I saw that as a Fannie Mae Challenge grant in California. We have a Fannie Mae Challenge grant here with Guilford County Schools, also doing workforce development with externships, building up workforce capacity and understanding. I actually do this lecture with the students and the CTE teachers. That's a possibility. I think we need to think really creatively about linking systems together. We've got folks doing food security, folks doing housing affordability, folks doing mental and behavioral health, folks doing immigrant and refugee resources, folks doing. What the pandemic has taught us is that all of this is related. Our health system can't fix it with Medicaid transformation. Our housing system can't fix it with Section 8 vouchers. Our homeless system can't fix it with a better continuum of care. Our mental health system can't figure it out with tailored plan. We need all of them working together and treating housing as a health problem, food as a transportation issue, workforce development as a racial justice issue all together and capitalize it, just pump the funding through it. It's really good for the economy to have all of that working. it will increase the number of jobs that are well paying, the spending that's local in nature. Two more.
Sorry, I was just curious about, you talked about ownership being a requirement to pay cash and all. What happened? How did they lose that property when 29 came through? Was it just in a domain? I mean, it sounds like you had it going all right and with ownership, but now in Warnersville, it's a government house.
Right.
And I hear they have to move out after 2 years. That's right.
There are ways to stay in longer, but yes, there's a cycle with public housing. So when we did urban redevelopment, we were able to define a neighborhood as blighted and then use federal funds to address the blight. Blight could be some code enforcement cases, and we know that policing and code enforcement are disproportionately impacting communities of color. North Carolina legislature just a few years ago approved a way that you can use 8 or more police visits in a year to trigger a code enforcement inspection. So if the police have been to your house for domestic violence or drunk disorderly or whatever, or an apartment complex, then it can trigger a code enforcement inspection of the property, which you'll always find issues. But that can then be used to displace people for, say, a baseball stadium that's being built in that way.
So they were just, the owners were just kicked out, they no longer have anything.
They are compensated in some way, but again, many of these properties are leveraged with mortgages, and so people end up bankrupt or. And I think there's another.
I was just going to say, back in the Model Cities area, Ford Foundation, I think Edward Lowe, who was an urban planner, and yeah, they tried in the New Haven area a plan called the Gray Area, something which they, because around Yale University, there was a lot of low-income houses, public housing, and they was trying to improve the problem, and they came up with a plan similar to what you were saying earlier, and it really worked.
There are models that work. Will it work here? Is there the political will? Are people going to stick their necks out and say, yes, we're going to sign those checks? I think we're getting there. We've had a radical shift here in our local politics where we've gone from a county commission that said small government at the heels of the Tea Party, and not investing in anything, to a county commission that's ready to work with cities. County's got the budget. County does the taxes on properties. The county manages the school system. Schools drive real estate markets. Look at the price differential in houses on the east side of town that are Grimsley's catchment. They're a block away from Dudley, but they go to Grimsley, versus those that are in Dudley's catchment area. Same house, block apart from each other. The one that's going to go to Grimsley is going to get 8 or 10 grand more than the one that's going into Dudley. So working together, county commission, school district, planners in the city, the affordable housing plan that the city of Greensboro just passed, all of the rehab money that's flowing through right now for improving housing quality, really just concentrating that all together with the other systems of care that are out there.
Thank you so much.
We cannot forget to thank you. I think you saw there was a lot of interest in what you're doing, and we're going to want to understand how we can connect with your work and support a lot of what you're doing. And I'm hoping you can hang around for a little bit, because I'm sure there's some people who want to speak with you one-on-one. Now, in terms of next week, we continue our series. Natalie Cass Miller will be our speaker, and she is going to talk about the historic Green Book movement, as well as a lot of the work that she's doing in Greensboro now. So make sure you're here for that. In terms of things we want to make sure you remember, on August 11th, that's a Wednesday, the Missional Engagement Leadership Team is hosting Chip Berry, who is the Director of Development for Greensboro Urban Ministry. And that has been a huge part of this church from the beginning of Greensboro Urban Ministry. That will be a Zoom session from 6:30 to 7:30. So mark that on your calendar to make sure you can be a part of that. And we are still looking for the big idea for our congregational effort. As you know, under the great leadership of Robbie Dunnigan, we built the Habitat House. And then we also helped with access to warm clothing and utility bill payment. And we're looking for another big idea for what we can do as a congregation. So think about that, and as you have an idea, please share it with us. And I also want to thank Robbie for being the person who introduced me to Stephen. Robbie's the one who brought this great speaker to us today. So thank you, Robbie. We appreciate that. Now, let's go to the Lord in prayer. God of all, we hear the persistent call to provide equitable access to food, to health, and to homes. Stir our hearts to move more deeply in our walk with Jesus so that we can make a transformative effort in these spaces. Continually open our eyes to the fact that one person and one congregation can make a difference, and help us to be those individuals and that congregation. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you all for being here. Looking forward to seeing you next week.